All right, welcome back to my history channel. So I'm going to go ahead and start a series, I guess, of um, just trying to watch these videos from Crash Course U.S. History, and just kind of comment on them or react to them and give you my opinion on what they are teaching or showing. I want to start off again by saying that everyone has a bias, and I'm not sure if we both are going to agree. Maybe we will. I don't know. But I'll go ahead and play it and give you my opinion as I'm watching it, and try to and if I agree with them, well, I agree. And if I disagree, well, I'll let you know. So I'll go ahead and react to the video. And hopefully it's not as long as my other two. My one on the presidents was pretty long, an hour and like a half, ranking the presidents. The other one was an hour on the one video on the Guys and Generals movie, somebody's reaction to that. And I hope you guys were informed by those and saw my opinion on those subjects. I'm going to go ahead and do this crash course and get it going and see where I agree and disagree with the guy who did this. I have watched a few, but that was like 2, 3, 4 years ago, something like that. I mean, this guy has had this channel going since 2013. So I don't really remember much about what I saw. I remember that there was some things I disagreed with, but I can't remember what they were or where it was. So I'll go ahead and play this and see what we have here, and I'll comment. Let me go ahead and get this thing bigger. I should have probably been maximizing it while I was talking to you guys, but oh well, it is what it is. Here we go. I want to say something as well. In the future, what I'm thinking on doing is going through every battle of the Civil War as they come up. So April, I think 14th was the firing on Fort Sumter, and there is a very good video video that this one I guess it's a company has on the Civil War, and they have a whole website with a video on every single battle of the Civil War, or at least most of them. So I will go ahead and play those as we come up to every battle and the exact date, and just go through them, comment on them, and give you again my opinion on them. And I hope you guys would be interested in something like that. Anyway, let's go ahead and without further ado, play this thing.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course U.S. History. No, Stan, that's not going to work, actually. I mean, we're talking about the 16th century today, when this was neither united nor states. By the way, this globe reflects the fact that I believe that Alaskan statehood is illegitimate. In fact, we're going to call this whole show U.S. History, but inevitably it's going to involve other parts of the world, and also, not to brag, a small part of the moon. Sorry, we can be a little bit self-aggrandizing sometimes here.
Yeah, United States did touch almost every part of the world, especially once we get to the 20th century.
In America. So to begin U.S. history, we're not going to talk about the United States or this guy. We're going to talk about the people who lived here before any Europeans showed up. North America was home to a great variety of people, so it's difficult to generalize, but here's what we can say. One, when the Europeans arrived, there were no classical-style civilizations with monumental architecture and empires like the Aztec or the Incas. And two, native North Americans had no metalwork, no gunpowder, no wheels, no written languages, and no domesticated animals. However, they...
Yeah, that is true. Let me just back it up so you guys can maybe read this over here.
Languages and no domesticated
and maybe
animals.
I'll
However,
read it too. But yeah, so one thing I will say is that I actually have become more, I won't say interested, but acknowledge, I guess, more the role of Native Americans in our country, especially before before the Europeans arrived, and just in talking within the context of what became the United States, what is now the United States. Unfortunately, though, we can't really go far back into the history of the Native Americans who met, for instance, Powhatan, who met the Jamestown colonists, or Massasoit and his tribe, who met the Pilgrims. You can't really go farther back than them because, again, they didn't keep any written records. And so the whole history of them in the back is just black. I mean, there is no very good knowledge about those people, except for maybe, if you go to Ohio, you see the burial mounds. But even then, like, how far back are they? I'm sure that they've dated them and things and told, but like the people themselves who built those, there's not a lot of information about them. How were they always there when settlers from Ohio came in there later on in the late 1700s, early 1800s? I mean, were those Native Americans that were in that vicinity, are they the same ones who built those mounds, or were the Native Americans that were there the ones that defeated and took over the ones who built those mounds? Or is it even older? I mean, has it been now several Native American tribes or nations that have come in and kicked out these Indians, the Native Americans before? So it's just, one can never know. Were the Wampanoags always there? Was their nation always there during let's say from the time of the Roman Empire till now, or are they some other nation that took over that area later? There's just so much mystery, and I think we should keep all that in context when we do speak of the Native Americans, that especially in the U.S. region, that we cannot know much about their history.
They did have farming, complex social and political structures, and widespread trade networks.
Mr. Green!
So they were pretty backwards, huh? Well, I mean, or at least primitive. Primitive is a funny word to me from the past because it implies a romanticization, these simple people who never used more than they needed and had no use for guns, and it also implies an infantilization. It's like you believe that just because you have a beeper and they didn't, they were somehow less evolved humans. But you can't see the human story as one that goes from primitive to civilized.
Okay, so that is where I actually agree. I mean, these people, we can't just say primitive and non-primitive. I actually don't believe in primitive, but that's basically because I don't believe in evolution. I think God made all people equally, and they all had the same abilities to come to knowledge, and I don't see any tribe or nation to be more inferior or more superior than any others. That's just my personal belief, and that historical perspective of mine. So yeah, I do not think that they were any less primitive or any less human, or should be taken, put and categorized that way. I think they had the full capabilities as we do. They just maybe didn't get to that point ever. But of course, Native Americans today know how to use a smartphone probably just as much as, I do. So maybe even more.
That's not just Eurocentric, that's contemporary-centric. The idea that we're moving forward as a species implies a linear progression that just does not reflect the reality of life on this planet. I get that you like to imagine yourself as the result of millennia of advancement and the very pinnacle of humanness, but from where I'm sitting, that worldview is a lot more backwards than living without the wheel. So no one knows exactly how many...
Well, see, my question would be, well, do you believe in evolution? Because the belief in evolution and human evolution leads to that conclusion. Charles Darwin believed that, all those people that did. And even now, I mean, if you believe in evolution, but don't believe in that anymore, then you are being inconsistent, because then how, humans evolved, and apparently. So yeah, a little inconsistent. So that's just how I view things there historically.
how many people lived in North America before the Europeans got here. Some estimates are as high as 75 million, but in the present US borders, the guesses are between 2 and 10 million. And like other Native Americans, their populations were decimated by diseases such as smallpox and influenza. Actually, it was much worse than decimation. As many of you have pointed out, decimation means 1 in 10. This was much worse than that. It was closer maybe to 8 in 10, which would be an octodecimation. So there had been civilizations in North America, but they peaked before the Europeans arrived. The Zuni and Hopi civilization, round about here, peaked about 1200 CE. They had large multiple family dwellings in canyons, which they probably left because of drought. Crash Course World History fans will remember that environmental degradation often causes the decline of civilizations. I'm looking at you, Indus Valley, and also you, entire future Earth. But complex civilizations weren't the rule in North America, and now we're about to begin generalizing. A bad habit historians have, partly because there's a limited historical record, but also because Eurocentric historians have a bad habit of primitifying.
So I guess he's saying that the cave dwellers and stuff who built those homes in the caves were way before the Europeans, and they were destroyed by disease before Europeans got there. So that's pretty interesting, actually. That there is that that he actually recognizes that. So yeah, I mean, why wouldn't there be diseases maybe that would wipe out people before Europeans? And obviously he's saying that what they call octinization or something, or octination or something like that, killed a lot. And apparently that was even before Europeans got there.
And simplifying others. So I want to underscore that there was huge diversity in the pre-Columbus American experience, and that talking about someone who lived here in 1000 BCE and talking about someone who lived here 2,000 years later is just inherent.
Yeah, I want to go back to that because, back to that map. Let me see if I can get back to it real quick, because I want to point something out, and maybe he's about to say something about it. But I mean, you look here at this map, and this is just like some of these: the Pawnee, the Shawnee, the Illinois. A lot of these are ones that colonists met in the 1800s. Like, was there, let's say, 100 years before the Pilgrims landed? Were the Pawnee even a thing? Were the Cheyenne even a thing? Did those come, were those starting to form as the settlers landed in America, and start, conquering areas? This is showing the territory from when the white men came in contact with them, or Europeans came in contact with them, but were their holdings vaster? I'm sure with all of this, there was increasing and decreasing of territories and things, and maybe some of these tribes that we see there were not always there. Maybe they formed and got bigger. Maybe the Pawnee had at one time controlled all of this and had brought all these other tribes underneath them, and then later on had, independence movements against them or things. So there's just a lot of stuff that I'm sure that this map is not going too far enough, and it's just hard to know, how far back that is.
Huge diversity in the pre-Columbus American experience, and that talking about someone who lived here in 1000 BCE and talking about someone who lived here 2,000 years later is just inherently problematic. That said, let's go to the thought bubble. Most native groups in most places organized as tribes, and their lives were dominated by the natural resources available where they lived. So West Coast Indians primarily lived by fishing, gathering, and hunting sea mammals. Great Plains Indians were often buffalo hunters. These tribal bands often united into loose confederacies or leagues, the best known of which was probably the Iroquois Confederacy, also called the...
Okay, so that's just assuming, just because of one Iroquois Confederacy, that there must have been a whole bunch of others. I mean, we don't see that really. Not a confederacy in that way. Now, when the Pilgrims landed in where Massasoit was, and again, maybe he'll mention this later, but when they landed where the Massasoit was paying tribute, I think, to the Massachusetts tribe. And why? Because the Massachusetts tribe basically had dominated the region. They were, like, you could say, the superpower of the region, and every other tribe had to pay tribute to the Massachusetts because they were the powerhouse there. So apparently that brought Massasoit and all the other Indian tribes around under their power. So kind of like an evil empire, that comes up and just submits all these different tribes underneath them. The Iroquois Confederacy didn't work like that. They were actually equal. All the different tribes that were part of that confederacy were equal. None was over any other one. They all had an equal share, kind of like the United States and the 13 colonies became the United States, kind of like that, amicable relationship where none was over the other. But that wasn't so, for instance, with the Massachusetts and that part to there. So, yeah, I mean, how many other confederacies were there? It sounds to me like he's trying to act like there was way more confederacies than just this one. No, that might actually be the only unique one.
The Great League of Peace. This was kind of like an upstate New York version of NATO, but without nuclear weapons or the incessant international meddling or Latvians. Okay, it was nothing like NATO, actually. Religion usually involved a vibrant spiritual world with ceremonies geared toward the tribe's lifestyle. Hunting tribes focused on animals, agricultural tribes on good harvests, and most Indian groups believed in a single creator god who stood above all the other deities, but they weren't monotheistic in the way that Christians who came to the New World were. American Indians also saw property very differently from Europeans. To First Peoples, land was a common resource that village leaders could assign families to use, but not to own, and most land was seen as common to everyone. As Black Hawk, a leader of the Sauk tribe, said, "The Great Spirit gave it to his children to live upon and cultivate as far as necessary for their subsistence, and so long as they occupy and cultivate it."
Interesting thing that the Europeans, when they first came, they actually tried to do this as well. Now, I'm not saying that they based it off how Indians did it, but they tried to do the whole sharing thing, and it just didn't work out.
They have a right to the soil. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So many of us tend to romanticize American Indians as being immune from greed and class, but in fact there were class distinctions in Indian tribes. Yep. Rulers tended to come from the same families, for instance. That said, wealth was much more evenly distributed than it was in Europe. And while most tribal leaders were men, many tribes were matrilineal, meaning that children became members of their mother's family. Also, women were often important religious leaders. Women also often owned dwellings and tools, although not land, because again, that idea did not exist. Also, in many tribes, women engaging in premarital scootily pooping wasn't taboo. In general, they were just much less obsessed with female chastity than Europeans were. I mean, I will remind you, the first English settlement in America was called Virginia. The idea that Native Americans were noble savages, somehow purer than Europeans and untouched by their vices, is not a new one. Like, some of the earliest Europeans saw the Indians as paragons of physical beauty and innocent of Europeans' worst characteristics. But for most Europeans, there was little noble about.
Yeah, I mean, even today, there's a lot of people that try to defend the Native Americans and act like, oh, they were way better than the Europeans morally and all this kind of stuff. No, they weren't. As is my belief as a Christian, all men have a bad nature to them. A sinful nature to them. So they all, all men are always going to be the same. There's not going to be some that, get away with being totally perfect and never doing wrong. There's always going to be that in humanity, no matter if you're European or Native American. So, the whole noble savage idea is not right either. Neither am I saying that, most Native Americans were cannibals and savage. They're, I don't believe in them being savages either, as the Europeans would end up describing them too. I mean, there was some things that Europeans at the time probably consider savage. Like, here's some examples right here: flaying somebody, pouring probably molten gold down their throat. But guess what? I mean, if you go back to the Roman era or even the Persians and Assyrians, I mean, they were just as evil as this. Now, European society had moved away from such savagery. So for Europeans, stuff like that was like, whoa, what in the world is going on? But if a lot of these Europeans would have lived at the time of, like the Bible, where it mentions the Assyrians invading Egypt, they would have witnessed a lot of flaying and torture and evil stuff like that. And I mean, you have the Spanish Inquisition going on at around this time, and they were flaying people too. So I mean, savagery is really in the eye of the beholder there.
About what they saw as pure Indian savagery. I mean, Indians didn't have writing, they suffered from the terrible character flaw of being able to have sex without feeling ashamed, and most importantly, they weren't Christians. The Spanish were the first Europeans to explore this part of the world. Juan Ponce de Leon arrived in what is now Florida in 1513 looking for gold and the fabled Fountain of Youth. In 1521, he encountered a Calusa brave's poison-tipped arrow and died before discovering that the Fountain of Youth is, of course, delicious Diet Dr. Pepper. Oh,
I don't know. I'm not into pop, so lemonade, something like that. But my favorite pop is root beer over Dr. Pepper. Dr. Pepper just tastes like medicine, glorified sugar medicine. Anyway.
Taste all 23 flavors. There were many more Spanish explorers in the first half of the 16th century, including one Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who wandered through the American Southwest looking for gold, which I mentioned entirely because I think that guy's last name means cowherd.
I guess it
none
does.
of these people found any gold, but they did make later European colonization easier by bringing over the microbes that wiped out most native populations. So the Spanish wanted to colonize Florida to set up military bases to...
Now, let me just touch on that a lot, because today there's a lot of people out there that they're like, oh yeah, it was genocide, the Europeans practiced genocide on the Native Americans by infecting them with all these diseases and things. Listen, it wasn't planned. It just wasn't planned. It's what happened, for instance, Squanto, his whole family was wiped out by a disease, and many people think that it's because there were fishermen that would come in that area fishing, and they had made contact with his family and just wiped them out with a disease. There's also the theory that it wasn't even any white men that did it, but and they just contacted something that came through them and wiped them out. Either way, but if it was these white fishermen, European fishermen coming through and infected them, it wasn't like they did it on purpose. Also, when he came in and he invaded Mexico City and knocked out the Aztecs and took control of the Aztecs, also just smallpox ran through them and killed many. It killed many Native Americans, many of the Aztec people there. But it wasn't on purpose. He didn't do it on purpose. I mean, he was allied with other Native Americans that did not like the Aztecs, and they worked together to bring down the Aztec Empire. And even those allies of his also contracted the smallpox and got, decimated just as much as the Aztecs, even though they were allied with Cortez. So Cortez didn't do it on purpose. The only one I think that may have done it on purpose was Pizarro, and he was just a monster. From what I hear, he actually infected blankets and things on purpose and sent them to the Incas to really bring down their numbers so he could conquer them faster. Also, I remember during the French and Indian War, the British one time did use infected clothing with smallpox infected clothing and sent it to an Indian tribe that was allied with the French to wipe them out. So there were times where genocide was used, but for the most part, the contact that was made with them and the decimation from smallpox was not intentional. Just like actually when Cuba was first conquered, the Spanish did a lot of horrible things to the Native Americans, but when the Native Americans got infected with smallpox from them, that was not done on purpose by the Spanish. I know a lot of people want to believe that happened, but it didn't.
To thwart the pirates who preyed on silver-laden Spanish
galleons
coming out of Mexico.
Pretty
but
cool.
Spanish missionaries also came over hoping to convert local native populations. This, of course, worked out magnificently, just kidding, it went terribly, and many of the missions were destroyed by an uprising of Gual Indians in 1597, and I will remind you, mispronouncing things is my thing. In general, colonizing Florida sucked because it was...
I will say, though, that well, I guess he is just talking about Florida. So I don't know much about the priests in Florida and things like that. I will say, though, that my experience in Mexico, a lot of the Catholic priests actually cared for the Native Americans and denounced the way the Spanish treated Native Americans. So there's that. But with Florida, I don't know much about that there.
Was hot and mosquito-y, Spain was much more successful at colonizing the American Southwest. In 1610, Spain established its first permanent settlement in the Southwest at Santa Fe, New Mexico, and you couldn't really say that it flourished since Santa Fe's population never got much above 3,000, but it had a great small-town feel. And New Mexico is really important because it's the site of the first large-scale uprising by Native Americans against Europeans. I mean, the native people, who the Spanish called pueblos, had seen their fortunes decline significantly since the arrival of Europeans. How much decline? Well, between 1600 and 1680, their population went from about 60,000 to about 17,000. Also, the Franciscan friars who came to convert the indigenous people became increasingly militant about stamping out all native religion. The Spanish Inquisition just wasn't very keen on the kind of cultural...
Okay, so I guess not all of them, I guess, had the same feeling. I mean, here we have some dudes burning alive those who didn't convert, and I'm sure there was a lot of that going on. But I'm wondering if there was a friar named Bartolome de las Casas who denounced a lot of what Europeans did to Native Americans. So I wonder if he denounced this as well.
Blending that made early conversion efforts successful. So while the Spanish saw all the pueblos as one people, they also...
I will add, though, that, I mean, the Catholics did this not just to Native Americans, they did it to Europeans, too. I mean, tons of Jews were burned burned like these people. Protestants were burned like these people. Protestants were burning people like people that disagree with them too. I mean, it was just, and that's where I'm saying, savagery is in the eye of the beholder, honestly.
Also knew there were tribal differences that made it difficult for the Indians to unite and rise up against the Spanish. But nothing unites like a common enemy, and in 1680, a religious leader named Pope organized an uprising to drive the Spaniards out. Pope organized about 2,000 warriors who killed 400 Spanish colonists and forced the rest to leave Santa Fe. So the Spanish colony in New Mexico was effectively destroyed. The pueblos tore down all the Christian churches and replaced them with kivas, their places of worship. But like most awesome uprisings, it didn't last. But after the revolt, the Spanish were much more tolerant of indigenous religion, and they also abandoned the forced labor practice called encomienda. Oh, it's time for the new Crash Course teacher.
Yeah, I'm actually I just got done teaching some kids down in Mexico, or preparing some lessons for them on that whole situation. There was a something set up called La Casa de Contratación, something along those lines. Contratación. And basically their policies were to be more so than the Spanish would be more tolerant and more kind to the Native Americans, and not try to force them into Catholicism, but to teach them and things like that, and be a lot more lenient with the Native Americans. There was even things like, you should pay the Native Americans for working for you, not just use them as slaves. So there was good things. I'm not going to say it was perfect, but it was good things. And a lot of it was help from the Catholic priests, actually, like the Friar Bartolome de las Casas and many others who just did not like what was happening to the Native Americans and made a big stink about it and everything.
Through the mystery document? How mysterious. The rules here are simple. I read and attempt to identify the mystery document. If I am right, I do not get shocked by this shock pen, and if I am wrong, I do. Okay, what do we have here? The Indians were totally deprived of their freedom and were put in the harshest, fiercest, most horrible servitude and captivity, which no one who has not seen it can understand. Even beasts enjoy more freedom when they are allowed to graze in the fields, but our Spaniards gave no such opportunity to Indians and truly considered them perpetual slaves. I sometimes came upon dead bodies on my way, and upon others who were grasping and moaning in their death agony, repeating, "Hungry, hungry." And this was the freedom, the good treatment, and the Christianity the Indians received. Well, that's nice. Okay, so the mystery document is always a primary source, and since the writer refers to our Spaniards, I'm gonna guess that he or she, probably he, is European, and a Spaniard sympathetic to the Indians, which narrows the list of suspects considerably. So it probably wasn't De Sepulveda, for instance, who argued that the Indians might not even be human. Okay, Stan, I'm actually pretty confident here. I believe it is from a short account of the destruction of the Indies by Bartolome de las Casas. Oh, dang
Interesting.
it! Oh, Stan just told me I have the author right, but the book wrong. It's a history of the Indies.
There you go.
Oh, I hate shocks, both literal and metaphorical. Ah! So we focused a lot on the brutality of the Spanish toward the Indians, but at least one Spaniard, de las Casas.
Yeah, so he's going to get into de las Casas, and he really changed the way that Spain was going to treat the Native Americans. I mean, he was a big help on that whole thing. I mean, he was good dude right there. Good dude.
Recognized that his countrymen were terrible. This realization is a good thing, obviously, but it leads us to one of the big problems when it comes to studying this time and place. The Black Legend is the tale that the Spanish unleashed unspeakable cruelty on the Indians. Now, that tale is true, but that idea was used by later settlers, especially the English, to justify their own settlements. Like, part of the reason they needed to expand their empire was to save the Indians from the awful Spanish. But were the English so much better? Yeah, probably not. As we mentioned at the beginning of today's episode, American Indians didn't have writing, so we don't have records of their perspective. Now, some Europeans, like de las Casas, were critical of the Spaniards, but most considered the Indians heathens and implied, or even outright said, that they deserved whatever horrible things befell them. So at the beginning of our series, I want to point out something that we need to remember throughout. One of the great things about American history is that we have a lot of written sources. This is the advantage of the U.S. coming onto the scene so late in the game, historically speaking. But every story we hear comes from a certain point of view, and we always need to remember who is speaking, why they are speaking, and especially which voices go unheard and why. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course.
Okay, so that's basically a point of view even used by Howard Zinn. Trying to say, oh, well, what about the people we don't know? Well, unfortunately, we just don't know about them. And like he said, we do just get a viewpoint from the Europeans. And I kind of do understand that point of view, actually. I just recently read, and he gets the natives and the English, and maybe we'll get to this later at some point. But he did mention about how the idea that Native Americans, especially in the U.S., what became the U.S., didn't have writing at all, so we don't know their point of view. And I just read a book on Rhode Island and when it was founded, and that actually came up one time with the beginning of the Pequot War, which I'm sure we'll get into later on here, where the Pequot, according to the English version, a couple Pequots murdered a European who had claimed a parcel of land. However, we do have the written treaty that the Europeans had, and one of the things stipulated in the treaty with the Pequot, and maybe just general with all the Indians in the area. I can't really remember specifics, but it was something like you actually had to purchase the land from these Native Americans. You had to. You couldn't just take it. I mean, the Puritans were against people just taking the land. You had to purchase it from them. And so, according to the Puritans, the Indians had killed this man. They believed the story of this man, the family of this man, who said that he had actually purchased the land that was in dispute between him and the two Indians that killed him. And the two Indians said, no, he had trespassed on their land. They didn't sell it to him. And, everything led up to a fight between them, and they ended up winning and killing him. So, who do you believe is a really good question. And just by reading more on the Puritans and how they treated Indians, even compared to Roger Williams, because Roger Williams was one of the few who actually stood by the Indians, and he was like a Bartolome de las Casas then, and pointing out how horrible the Puritans were to the Indians. It's that's where you question, well, who do you believe? How can we believe them? So I think you can't, I'm not saying, I don't agree with just siding with the Native Americans or just siding with the Europeans. You just have to say, we can never know. We have what the Puritans said. Do I trust them? After I read what they ended up doing with other Native Americans and what they ended up doing with Rhode Island and trying to take Rhode Island as a colony off the map because they disagree with them on Christian doctrine and things. Yeah, I don't know if I would go so far as to say, yeah, I trust the Puritans over the Native Americans. I just don't. So for me personally, when it gets to things like that, I'm just like, we'll never know. We'll never know the truth of that story and why it happened. And I honestly won't. I honestly just leave it as a neutral mark. I put myself neutrally in that position, saying I can't say either way. I'm not going to say who is right, who is wrong, because we'll never know. All we get is the point of view of one side and not the other. So, anyway, that's the video for today. There were some things as I was watching I didn't expect. Hopefully, we don't get more of that in the next ones. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sure it is shorter than the last one I did. And we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you, and have a good day.